Look, not everyone likes change. In fact, I very much prefer things to stay the same. I like walking into my supermarket knowing that the cereal will be in the same aisle it was last week. I like the consistency of hearing Mariah Carey on the radio at Christmas time. I take great comfort in knowing that the books of my Bible will appear in the same order each and every week that I open it. All this to say is that sameness and predictability offers us some kind of comfort. It steadies us. But as a church, we have come into a season of change. We're in the midst of transitioning between pastors, and this change may be unsettling for some of us. This morning, then, I'd like us to think about what it would take to remain unified as a church community while we navigate this change. How do we remain united as a church community while we are navigating a season of change? And this is why I'm turning to Ephesians chapter 4, and this is why I'm inviting you to turn there also. And we're going to read from chapter 4, verse 1 onwards. The Apostle Paul said the following things, wrote the following things. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. One of the changes the Ephesian Christians were grappling with was a mixed congregation. One of the changes the apostle was writing into was a church dealing with a mixed congregation. Differing ethnicities were coming together in one community to worship the one true and living God. And Paul talked about this in chapter 2, where he said, Jesus made us both, that's the various ethnicities represented in a congregation, he made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of two, so making peace. So then, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. As you think about that, keep in mind that a good number of Jewish converts to Christianity, this change was significant to them. This was new territory to a lot of them. This changed the way that they perceived worship. For instance, if they grew up in synagogue, their worship would have looked, for the large part, rather ethnically homogeneous. In synagogue, you're worshiping with other Jewish people, by and large. And if you think about it, on their biggest religious festivals, on the big religious events that they hosted in Jerusalem year by year, the temple itself was specifically structured to make sure that there was a visible line differentiating between Jewish worshippers and everyone else. It was a visible boundary that was in place between Jewish worshippers of God and everybody else who came to worship God. So when these Jewish converts started coming to church, all this cultural baggage about ethnic separation came with them. And Paul had to patiently teach them the old way of coming to God is over. Jesus has come. And when he died as a sin offering, he died for all sinners alike. When he died as a sin offering, he died for all sinners alike. Jewish sinners as well as every other sinner. Consequently, this created a Christian community in which everybody could be unified and equally come to worship the one and true living God. But how? How? Given the change many Jewish worshippers had to work through, how would they cultivate this remarkably united Christian community in which everyone, every ethnicity were equally welcome to come and worship the one and true living God? How could they possibly create such a community? Our passage shines light on this. Change was upon them and they had to navigate it, and our passage helps us see how they navigated this dramatic change from their past. Let's begin in verse 1. I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Paul is crystal clear here with the issue he's trying to address. He wants his readers, this congregation, grappling with a change of worshipping alongside people that they would not historically associate with, to walk in a manner worthy of their calling, to come to church in a manner worthy of their calling. That is, they are to conduct themselves as a unified Christian community. Now, if I was to ask you, if I said to you, look, next week I'd like you to present a lecture or a seminar or a Bible study on how to maintain Christian unity, I wondered what sort of things you would start to jot down on your list of how would you do that? How would you go about this? If you wanted true Christian unity, what sort of things would you think are important in order to cultivate unity? I wonder if our list would look anything like verses 2 and 3. There the apostle said, you're to create this kind of, or maintain this kind of unity with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There's a lot to think about in a list like that, isn't there? We are to walk in a manner worthy of our calling. We are to be a unified Christian church. And then the apostle lands this on our laps. There's a lot for us to think about. So let's begin at the top. Humility. And the lexicon refers to this as a disposition of valuing or assessing oneself appropriately, especially in light of one's sinfulness or creatureliness. That's the sense of the word there. What does it mean to be humble within Christian community? It's the ability to assess yourself rightly, and not to get too big for your own boots, as the expression would be. This is simply to say, whenever we're navigating a season of change, especially in church life also, let's do this. Let's do this by interacting with one another from a less entitled posture, as though all the change that happens must happen my way or the highway. Let's shun that kind of disposition that we have towards each other. That if the change doesn't happen how I want it to happen, I'm out of here. Now, the apostle tells us humility will help us steer through a season of change. We are to esteem the worth of one another, the dignity given to each of us struggling sinners as saints and members of the household of God. Remember that. Remember that. Humility will help us greatly. Secondly, we're encouraged to navigate change with gentleness. Gentleness is a funny word, isn't it? It's hard to define sometimes when you're just told, be gentle with one another. In my mind, it just sounds like a bit of a free-floating, hippie-ish virtue that Christians are supposed to blindly indulge. But it's much deeper than that, isn't it? If you've been following Jesus closely for some time now. Paul helps us handle a season of change well by an appeal to imitate the gentleness of Jesus. It was Jesus who said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle." I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. So the gentleness that would help us navigate a season of change is the gentleness we learn from Jesus. It is the gentleness we learn from following Jesus closely. And next, Paul talks about patience. And to be honest, this is one of the more difficult things to learn in Christian life, isn't it? Patience is hardly valued anymore. No one values patience. If we want food, we go drive-through, right? If we want to buy something, we don't even have to wait for the shop to open. We just shop online. Our capacity for patience is in a desperate need of recovery. And none more so when we're navigating seasons of change in Christian community together. And here's why. Because sometimes change brings out the very worst in us, doesn't it? Sometimes when things change, it brings out the very worst in us as people. It's like a trigger. You change something, it's like a trigger, and it brings out all those sinful defaults that we carry. We get anxious, and so we spill our angst among the community that we are called to love. Or we might be frustrated by the change in Christian community, so we pull back. We pull back from our Christian community. We pull back from the relationships that we are called to create. Lots of things can go sideways in seasons of change. Lots of things can go sideways. And Paul is wise to this. He knows change can be difficult. And he teaches, as we encounter the anxieties and the frustrations and the Christian immaturity from other people, don't retaliate. When they spill their angst on you, when they make a mess of a relationship here and there, don't retaliate. Rather, engage them with patience. Engage with patience. And this would mean deliberate slowness on our part. A deliberate holding back of trying to fix everything quickly and trying to manage everything quickly. It would be a hesitancy on our part not to aggravate or inflame the situation that others are trying to deal with in their own broken and misguided ways. A deliberate attempt to be hesitant to inflict further damage where damage is already being done relationally. And then Paul goes on to say, bearing with one another in love. Bearing with one another in love. The word bearing here has an element of tolerance or forbearance. with one another? I know for myself, just personally speaking, I struggle with tolerance and bearing with certain types of personalities. I really do. And it's not because that personality type is sinful. It's not that at all. But it's because I have so much more to learn about enjoying those who sit on the other end of the personality spectrum from me. And you could probably think about all kinds of situations where you didn't feel particularly tolerant of other people, where you didn't particularly want to get along with other people. And it's not because there was sin involved. It's not because they sinned against you. It's simply because there was a difference of composure, a difference of attitude, a difference of personality and preference, but not sin. But here is wisdom once more for you. In the local church, bearing with one another in love, not just with those Christians or those few Christians you find easy to love. Notice how Paul says that, right? He says, bear with one another. All the others, bear with one another in your Christian community. All of them. And this brings me to the last item on Paul's list. Creating Christian community or maintaining Christian unity in a season of change requires us to be eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. This speaks to a pervasive attitude within a Christian community, within a church. A pervasive attitude of eagerness to be unified with one another. In fact, the word eager stresses this point so clearly because it literally means spare no effort. Spare no effort. Do as much as you are possibly able to do to maintain the unity of your Christian church. If you think about this from the original audience's perspective, Paul here is instructing the Jewish and the Gentile Christians who found themselves worshiping together in one community, in one congregation. Paul intentionally teach each of them to spare no effort. Jewish converts, I know you're not used to the Gentiles being here with you, but spare no effort. Do everything you possibly can to welcome them as a brother or sister in Christ. And to the Gentile believers who may have for so long felt excluded in the community of faith, just make the same effort. Make the same effort. Do everything you possibly can to be at unity with a person who is ethnically different from you. Love them. Love them. For a church like us, the application is not hard to make at this point. Many of us come from such diverse backgrounds. Our stories, our immigration, our exposure to various Christian denominations, our preferences for a particular style of music or a particular dress code or a particular brand of coffee. We all have our differences, right? We do have our differences. We are different people. But in good and generous measure, slap it on thick, right? In good and generous measure, we are encouraged by the apostle to spare no effort. Go above and beyond. Do everything you possibly can. Go as far as you possibly can to maintain genuine Christian unity. Be eager to do so. And this is how the Apostle Paul sets it out for us. He says, walk in a manner worthy of your calling, and this will include unity as a Christian church. And then he tells us how we are to take steps towards this noble goal. And the question still hangs, doesn't it? How? How? I mean, it's nice that you point out all these virtues, Paul, but still the question is how? How can we achieve this pervasive sense of unity? How is this even possible in a Christian church? What central hub, what central idea would have sufficient gravity to hold us, in spite of all our differences and preferences, in a stable orbit of humility, gentleness, patience, forbearance, and passionate unity? What could possibly have that kind of gravitational pull to hold us together this way? I think Paul anticipated that very question. I think Paul anticipated the question and then prepared the answer. He knew it was coming. He knew someone would ask, but why? Why should we bother with this kind of unity? Why not just do super exclusive church for each preference and each music type and each demographic? Why not separate the church out so that it can accommodate to our preferences? The thing that will hold us all together in spite of all our differences is the gospel. It is the gospel. The gospel is the central hub, the key idea with sufficient gravity to help us navigate a season of change in stable orbit. It is the key idea that will keep us unified. We see this in verses 4 onwards. The apostle writes, "There is one body and one spirit, just as you called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." Over and over, the apostle stresses how much oneness befits the Christian church, how much oneness belongs to us as a people. There is one body, one Spirit, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. All this oneness created for us by the triune God. And you see the reference there to the triune God, do you not? One Spirit, the apostle says. One Lord, and this is just a reference to the fundamental Christian confession that Jesus is Lord. So there's one Spirit, there's one Lord, and one Father. To say it another way, the unity of the church, in large measure, imitates the unity of God Himself. Though three persons, there is only one God. In fact, the beloved Anglican minister John Stott was so passionate about this verse that he wrote the following. He said, "Christian unity arises from our having one Father, one Savior, one indwelling Spirit." And he says, so we cannot possibly foster a unity which pleases God either if we deny this doctrine of the Trinity. More than this, our capacity for unity as a Christian body, by which I mean a commitment of love and eagerness to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, is unity which arises from the gospel believed. It's not just the gospel out there for us just to think about loosely. The unity of a Christian church comes from when people believe the gospel together. That is to say, that unity, Christian unity, is not just a virtue for us to discuss. It is a reality to be tasted and enjoyed through the gospel. We love and enjoy and taste Christian unity because of the gospel. And this is where the apostles' thoughts now turn. If you look at verses 7 to 8. but grace was given to each of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives and he gave gifts to men. If you were to ask, how does the gospel create this sense, this true sense of Christian unity, the answer would go something like this. The gospel establishes, it's the foundation of true Christian unity because it is unrelenting on this one point. It is unrelenting on this one point. Are you ready? Not one of us got ourselves into the Christian church, into the Christian faith, because of something we were able to accomplish. Not a single one of us got ourselves into the Christian faith because of something we were able to accomplish. The apostle says, grace was given to each of us. Grace was given to each of us. That's what we needed to get into this Christian faith, right? That's what we needed to come to God through Christ by the power of the Spirit. Grace was given to each one of us. And Paul explained the meaning of this grace gift elsewhere when he said, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of something that you're able to accomplish, so that no one may boast. No one can come to church and say, I'm better than other people. I've got it more figured out than other people. I'm less blind than other people. No, we are here because we received a gift of grace so that no one may boast. So because the gospel levels the playing field, meaning we all came to Christ the same way, namely by the extraordinary grace of God, we have unity with one another. We can truly look each other in the eye and say, you were like me and I'm like you. I'm here because I received the grace of God like you did. The same grace. He drew me to himself. That's why I'm here. And that's why you're my brother. And that's why you're my sister. We are all alike before God more than we are different in respect to the gospel. Secondly, the gospel establishes our unity because it is honest about our need for common grace. It's honest about our common need for grace, I should say. It's honest about our need for grace because we all needed it. We all needed grace. Paul picks up on this in verse 8 when he said, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives and he gave gifts to men. Paul is right there calling to mind a psalm. He's thinking about something in the Old Testament there. He's quoting from an old psalm which recalls a king who had returned victoriously from battle. And this king has now dealt with his enemies, and now he returns to his capital to enjoy the spoils. The king has conquered, and now he returns to his capital city to enjoy the spoils. Only this king doesn't keep the spoils for himself. In Paul's estimation, this king that he's talking about is the gift giver, not the gift receiver. He is the gift giver, not the gift receiver. That's a pretty generous king, wouldn't you say? That's a kind and generous king. I'd like to know a king like that. But the psalm also depicts this king as one who ascended. It is a king that went on high somewhere. He went up to his capital city, to the place from which he now rules. And Paul clearly thought that this old psalm, written well before Jesus arrived, had something to do with Jesus. That somehow this psalm told us something about King Jesus as the giver of grace, and King Jesus who is the one who ascended to his heavenly capital from where he now rules. Paul thought that this old psalm pointed forward to Jesus somehow. And because King Jesus did ascend on high and now is established in his heavenly kingdom from where he now rules, when he went there and he went to his heavenly kingdom, when he went to the capital on high, he leads all these captives. The psalm still applies. He led the captives as he went there, all these POWs who surrendered to him during his campaign. And at one instance, when we think about POWs, we think about those who may have been captured by this King Jesus as those putrid rebels who continue to shake their fist at God day in and day out. Yeah, maybe that's the kind of captives that the psalmist had in mind and that Paul may have had in mind. But thinking about what Paul said earlier in his letter, I think it suits far better to see the captives spoken of here as former enemies of God who are now at peace with God. Those who Jesus leads are former enemies, but now allies. I think so because the apostle said in previous passages, he said Christians were once known as sons of disobedience, by nature children of wrath, at the time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. We were, so to speak, fighting a war against God, meaning we were the ones in need of being captured by a gracious king. We were desperately in need of being captured by this gracious king. We all were in need of grace, which God gave and now leads us as allies of the gracious and generous king. So, what shall we say about all these things then? What shall we say about a passage like this? We all know that the original readers had their own season of change to deal with. You had two or more ethnicities coming together in a church to worship the one and true living God. But in the gospel, God has given them everything they need to get along in humility, gentleness, patience, forbearance, and visible unity. So, with change coming to us also, may we remember to keep the gospel, God's gift of grace and our need for grace, front and center. May we unite ourselves and rally around this gospel. May we prize it, hold it high, focus ourselves upon it, and so let it help us navigate a season of change with a posture of humility and gentleness and patience and forbearance, leading to a visible unity for all to enjoy.